Imagine spending your entire life acting as the dependable safety net for your family, only to realize that your worth to them is measured entirely in what you can financially provide. This is the heartbreaking true story of a devoted aunt and sister who gave everything to her relatives, only to be completely erased from their moments of joy and celebration. But what her entitled family didn't realize was that the quiet, compliant woman they casually discarded was about to wake up, draw a permanent line, and orchestrate a masterful financial cutoff that would change their lives forever. Let me introduce you to Evelyn. She is a 68-year-old widow who had spent decades playing the role of the quiet supporter. Ever since her husband Carl passed away 7 years ago, she had become the family's dependable aunt and helpful sister. Whenever anyone's checking account dipped too low, or if the kids needed a little extra money for summer camp, Evelyn was always the one they called. She never asked for repayment and never held her generosity over their heads, simply telling herself that helping out was exactly what family did. Over the years, her financial sacrifices for them were substantial. When her brother's hours got cut at his job, Evelyn stepped in without hesitation and covered their mortgage for 3 months. When her niece desperately needed a down payment for her first car, Evelyn wired the money that exact same afternoon. Her neat, precise handwriting filled dozens of pages in a dedicated folder containing passwords, policy numbers, and account balances for the various bills she paid on their behalf. She had quietly absorbed everyone's burdens for so long, mistakenly believing it was a noble way to show her love. But the universe has a painful way of revealing what you try not to see. It happened on a beautiful Saturday morning. Evelyn was peacefully stirring cream into her coffee when her phone suddenly buzzed. Initially, she assumed it was just an automated appointment reminder or a sale notification from the local garden center. However, when she tapped the screen, she saw her niece's name attached to a single photo message with no preceding text. Holding her breath without realizing it, Evelyn swiped to open the picture. Staring back at her was a massive, joyous family gathering. There they all were, her brother, her sister-in-law, their children, her other niece with her husband, and even the babies perched happily on their laps. They were all smiling brightly in front of a massive blue banner that ironically read, "Family Reunion, Love Always Wins." Evelyn studied every single face in the photograph, desperately searching for some explanation written in their eyes, but there was nothing. There were just rows of matching t-shirts and smiling faces, with absolutely no space carved out for her and no empty chair waiting. She carefully set her phone down on the table as gently as if it were made of glass. The words on the banner felt like a hollow echo in her quiet, empty room. She kept frantically thinking that maybe it was a simple oversight. Perhaps an invitation got lost in the mail, or she had somehow missed a phone call. But a while later, her phone buzzed again. With trembling hands, she reached for the device and finally opened the text message that had followed the devastating photo. It was a single, breezy line from her niece. "Hope you're well, Aunt Evelyn. We missed you." She read the careless words 2 or 3 times, realizing they were as light as air. The message contained absolutely nothing that hinted at regret or apology. It was just a casual acknowledgement, treating Evelyn like an afterthought or a distant relative you simply feel obligated to mention. As she sat in her chair by the window, staring out at the fading hydrangeas in her yard, the crushing truth finally settled over her. Family apparently did not include her when there were joyful memories to be made and photos to be taken. For years, Evelyn had tried to ignore how small it made her feel when their thank yous grew shorter and their financial expectations grew larger. Even at Carl's wake 7 years ago, she remembered standing in the living room and realizing her family was just talking around her about funeral details and leftover casseroles, treating her as a mere prop in her own grief. Today felt no different, except she no longer had Carl there to squeeze her hand. She realized that she had spent a lifetime deeply involving herself in their problems, but they had never once thought to involve her in their joy. Her chest felt tight with the heavy, undeniable knowledge that she was not as indispensable to them as she had always believed. But in that sorrowful, quiet kitchen, Evelyn didn't cry and she didn't shout. Instead, something fundamental inside her shifted. She stared out at the yard until the shadows lengthened, and for the very first time, she began to wonder what her life would look like if she finally stopped trying to earn her place in a family that refused to truly see her. After the devastating realization that her family had entirely excluded her from their joyful reunion, Evelyn didn't move from her chair for a very long time. The house around her was painfully silent, save for the soft hum of the refrigerator and the steady tick of the clock over the stove. It was as if the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting to see what she would do next. Eventually, hunger and deeply ingrained habit reminded her she was still tethered to this world. Evelyn stood up, her aging knees aching slightly, and poured her cold coffee down the sink. She wiped the kitchen counter with careful, practiced strokes, keeping things tidy and making sure everything was exactly in its place. In that quiet moment, she realized this had been the overarching theme of her entire life, making things easier for everyone else and quietly stepping aside so others could feel comfortable. This pattern had started when she was just a little girl. She remembered being 8 years old, a time when her mother would fall into dark spells, retreating to her bedroom for days. Evelyn would climb onto the counter, heat up a can of soup, and meticulously set the table for her brothers so the household wouldn't completely collapse. That was the birth of the toxic idea that her worth was measured entirely in what she could do for other people. But sitting there, with the image of their smiling faces burned into her mind, she finally saw how small and invisible this endless capacity to absorb their burdens had made her. Driven by a sudden, intense clarity, Evelyn walked to her desk and pulled out a thick manila folder. Her neat, precise handwriting filled dozens of pages with passwords, policy numbers, and account balances. Inside was the gas bill for her brother's house, a mobile phone plan for her niece, and an insurance premium for her sister-in-law's car. At the time, taking on these expenses had felt like love, but now it felt like a detailed ledger of her own erasure. In that moment, Evelyn understood something simple and devastating. She was not indispensable to her family, she was merely convenient. And convenience has a dangerous way of becoming entitlement. She pressed the folder to her chest and listened to her steady heartbeat. It told her she did not have to keep buying her place in their lives. She finally realized that cutting the cord didn't make her cruel. The only person she had been truly unkind to was herself. She had been a supporting character for far too long, and it was time to be the main character in her own life. That afternoon, Evelyn made herself a fresh cup of tea and set the folder on the kitchen table. She reached for the first document, the utility bill for her brother's house. She remembered the cold night he had called last winter, deeply ashamed that his furnace had broken and he couldn't keep his kids warm. Of course, she had stepped in to save the day and had faithfully paid it for months. She logged into the utility account. A small voice inside wondered if she was really going to stop being their reliable safety net. But a steadier voice answered yes, because by being their safety net, she had trained them to offer no gratitude, no inclusion, and no consideration in return. Taking a sip of her grounding tea, she navigated to the settings page and firmly clicked the box labeled Remove Payment Method. She didn't stop there. She immediately moved on to the mobile phone plan she had added her niece to 3 years ago when the girl lost her job. Her niece had promised to take over the payments but never did. Evelyn stared at her niece's phone number, the exact same number used to send that devastating photo of the reunion. She felt a brief pang of guilt, but aggressively pushed through it, knowing that generosity given without respect quickly ferments into toxic obligation. With a few swift clicks, she canceled the line. When she was done, she exhaled, feeling a sorrowful relief, feeling exactly like she was setting down a massive load she had carried for far too long. She poured her tea down the sink, her movements remarkably calm. For the first time in years, she wasn't anxiously bracing for the next financial request. A short while later, the phone rang, lighting up with her brother's name. She imagined his sheer confusion over the automated cancellation email, but she refused to pick up. They already knew exactly what they were doing to her, having always expected her to pick up their broken pieces without complaint. Evelyn stood by the window, watching a squirrel dart frantically across the lawn. Instead of feeling skittish and reactive like the squirrel, she felt a profound stillness. She thought of her late husband, Carl, who used to gently tell her, "You're allowed to have edges. You don't have to be soft all the time." She finally understood what he meant. Pressing her palm against the warm window glass, she felt she was reclaiming a vital part of herself she had lost. She knew this was only the beginning, but for the first time, she was completely ready to draw the permanent line. It didn't take long for the calls to turn into voicemails. The first few were polite, almost tentative, as if her family wasn't quite sure whether they were allowed to be angry yet. Her brother's voice was carefully measured through the speaker, casually mentioning a mix-up with the utility bill and asking her to call him back when she had a minute. Her niece also reached out, claiming her phone got shut off by mistake. She insisted it was no big deal, but just wanted to check in. Evelyn sat silently and listened to each message, letting the empty words sink in without responding. For so long, she had been quick to smooth over these misunderstandings, eager to reassure everyone that she was still there to help and that they didn't need to feel bad for relying on her. But now, sitting at her kitchen table with the folder of canceled accounts beside her, she realized how painfully familiar their voices sounded. Not warm, not remorseful, just expectantly demanding. By the third day, the tone of the messages had completely changed. Her sister-in-law's voice was brittle with irritation, aggressively stating that she didn't know why Evelyn decided to do this now, and complaining that it was putting them in a hard bind. She coldly claimed that they had always appreciated the help, but called Evelyn's sudden boundary spiteful. Evelyn turned the word over in her mind like a pebble in her palm. If finally setting a boundary felt like spite to them, she realized it was only because they had never seen her do it before. They didn't know any other version of her, but the one who quietly and obediently absorbed the inconvenience of others. Evelyn was still thinking about that painful revelation when the doorbell suddenly rang. Her heart fluttered in her chest, a nervous reflex she couldn't completely control. A small part of her still desperately wanted to believe someone had actually come to apologize and say they understood how she felt. But when she opened the door, it was her brother standing there, holding his ball cap in both hands like a little boy sent to the principal's office. He looked incredibly tired and much older than she remembered. His voice was gentle in the exact way it always was when he wanted something, as he quietly asked if they could talk. Evelyn stepped aside to let him inside, realizing that some habits simply die harder than others. He sat down heavily at the kitchen table while Evelyn poured him a fresh cup of coffee. It struck her profoundly that this was the very first time in years he had come by her house without needing her to babysit or lend him money. Even now, though, this specific visit carried a clear agenda. After taking a sip, he expressed his confusion, reminding her that they had been going through a rough patch and stating he thought she was okay with helping out. "I was," Evelyn said softly, calmly folding her hands in her lap. "For a long time." He looked up, clearly surprised by the steady evenness in her voice. He had likely expected her to be flustered, to scramble, or to anxiously justify herself. Instead of apologizing, he pressed on, arguing that she could have said something and insisting they would have invited her to the reunion. He defensively claimed it wasn't meant to hurt her. Evelyn studied the deeply etched lines in his face, finding him so intensely familiar and yet so strange all at once. This was the same brother she had loaned money to when his first marriage ended, and the same man she had sat beside in a hospital waiting room when his son broke his arm. She realized he wasn't a monster. He was just entirely accustomed to her enduring silence. "Maybe it wasn't meant to hurt me," she finally said to him. But it did. Uncomfortable, he shifted in his chair and offered a hollow defense, stating that they were family and that they loved her. Evelyn nodded slowly. "I know," she replied, "but love shouldn't feel like a transaction." He stared at her, his mouth opening and closing as if he desperately wanted to argue but couldn't find the right words. In that quiet moment, Evelyn felt a heavy weight loosen in her chest. It was not victory or vindication, just a pure release. He finally broke the silence, telling her she had always been so generous, framing it as though her generosity was a personal flaw she needed to apologize for. He insisted it was just who she was. Evelyn agreed that it was, but firmly added that she believed she had been confusing true generosity with toxic obligation. Sighing and rubbing a hand exhaustedly over his face, he admitted he didn't know what she expected them to do now. "I expect you to take care of your own bills," Evelyn told him gently. "I expect you to understand that I'm tired." They sat together in a deep silence, the kind of silence that is far too heavy to fill with empty words. Finally, he stood up and set his completely untouched coffee on the counter. With his voice tight, he conceded that they would just have to figure it out. Evelyn calmly walked him to the front door. As he stepped out onto the porch, he turned back to look at her with an expression she couldn't quite read, some complicated mixture of bewilderment and deep resentment. For a fleeting moment, she almost reached out to him, almost said she was sorry, and almost promised to fix it all. But she didn't. She firmly closed the door behind him and leaned her forehead against the cool wood. Her heart was beating hard in her chest, but for the first time, it wasn't beating out of fear. It was the exhilarating feeling of her life finally becoming her own. She knew the manipulative calls would keep coming, and the heavy guilt would occasionally echo in her mind. But she also knew this was the only way to unlearn the lifelong patterns that had kept her so small. And for the first time in her life, Evelyn felt absolutely certain that she could. The days that followed Evelyn's bold confrontation were quiet, much like the hushed, roaring calm found in the aftermath of a severe storm. Each morning, she woke before the sun, made herself a warm cup of tea, and sat peacefully with her thoughts. She had always imagined that drawing hard boundaries with her relatives would feel harsh or make her a bitter person, but instead, it felt incredibly refreshing, like finally taking a deep breath after years of holding it in. With her newfound clarity, Evelyn began meticulously sorting through the massive tangle of financial obligations she had woven around herself over the decades. She tackled the list methodically, canceling the insurance policies she had been paying for her sister-in-law, the various streaming services she had added to help her brother's kids feel normal during the pandemic, and the grocery delivery subscriptions she had initially signed up for when her niece was on bed rest, and had simply kept renewing out of habit. It took the better part of a week to unravel it all, but each phone call she made to a customer service representative felt like a small, profound act of liberation. By Thursday morning, she officially canceled the very last subscription on her list, the monthly grocery delivery. Later that same afternoon, her niece called, and Evelyn purposefully let it go to voicemail. Her niece's recorded voice was tight and controlled as she complained about being put in a hard position, aggressively stating, "You know, we count on you." Her family was still treating her as if she were a convenient service rather than a living, breathing human being. When the audio message ended, Evelyn didn't replay it. She simply deleted it and set her phone face down on the kitchen counter. She thought of her late husband, Carl, who used to affectionately tease her for apologizing to cashiers and doctors as if the word sorry was her punctuation. All these years, she had been endlessly sorry for taking up space and for wanting more out of life than just to be needed by ungrateful people. Determined to rediscover herself, Evelyn went to the hall closet and pulled out a dusty box containing old photo albums and letters. As she turned the worn pages, she allowed herself to remember the vibrant woman she had been before becoming her family's permanent financial safety net. She remembered the woman who used to paint beautiful watercolors on Sunday afternoons, who took long, aimless drives, and who laughed loudly without ever worrying if her joy made someone else uncomfortable. She felt that old version of herself stirring inside, as if she had just been waiting for permission to finally return. For the first time in a very long while, she didn't feel hopelessly trapped in other people's heavy expectations. Instead, she felt a bright sense of possibility. The next morning, Evelyn woke to a completely silent phone resting on her nightstand. No demanding texts, no angry voicemails, just pure silence. For a fleeting moment, she worried that this total isolation was the steep price of finally telling the truth, and that she would be completely alone. But then, a simpler, more profound realization washed over her. She had actually been alone for years, but she had just been far too busy serving others to notice it. Feeling as though she had been handed a blank canvas, she pulled out her old address book and thumbed through the names of friends she had drifted away from. She stopped at the name of her old friend Helen, whom she hadn't properly spoken to in ages because her life had become a revolving door of her family's constant emergencies. Evelyn dialed the number, and Helen picked up on the second ring, her voice warm and genuinely surprised. They talked for nearly an hour about nothing and everything. When Helen asked how her family was doing, Evelyn hesitated for only a single heartbeat before telling her the absolute truth. She was officially stepping back to take care of herself. Helen murmured gently, "Good for you." And when Evelyn hung up, she felt distinctly lighter, as if someone had finally told her she didn't have to carry the heavy load all alone. Inspired by the wonderful connection, Evelyn decided to host a gathering, not for her entitled family out of strict obligation, but just for herself. She pulled out the good plates that had been gathering dust in the cabinet, bought fresh flowers, baked Helen's favorite lemon bars, and uncorked a nice bottle of wine. When Saturday arrived, Helen and two other old friends sat around Evelyn's kitchen table, talking and laughing as if no time had passed at all. Looking around at their smiling faces, Evelyn felt a deep, comforting warmth and a true sense of belonging that asked absolutely nothing in return. When Helen reached across the table, squeezed her hand, and simply said, "You look happy," Evelyn smiled back and agreed. In that small, completely ordinary moment, she finally realized that genuine love doesn't ever have to be bought or bargained for. It can be quiet, mutual, and freely given. Hello, I am Bayen Kitch, your AI assistant. Here is the final part of Evelyn's empowering journey, along with a powerful takeaway lesson to share with your YouTube audience. A week later, Evelyn sat at her desk with the familiar folder of financial records, the one she had once guarded like a sacred text. Only this time, she wasn't there to pay bills or solve her family's problems. She was there to set one final intention. She carefully opened the envelope containing her will, which her lawyer had prepared years ago when Carl was still alive and their plans were simpler. Back then, the assumption was to leave everything to family simply because that was what you were supposed to do. As she read over the pages, she felt the heavy weight of those old assumptions, as if her love was a debt she had to repay with every penny she had ever saved. But Evelyn knew better now. Picking up her pen, she began making bold notes in the margins. She jotted down questions for her lawyer about changing her beneficiaries and adjusting her trusts, ensuring that whatever she left behind would go to the people and causes that had actually given something back to her, no matter how small. When she finally put the pen down, she felt an unexpected, profound calm. There was no vengeance or anger left in her heart, just the quiet, deep satisfaction of knowing that her life and everything in it was finally her own. Later that afternoon, the doorbell rang. When Evelyn opened the door, she was genuinely surprised to see her granddaughter standing on the porch, clutching a small canvas tote bag. The young girl looked unsure, her hair pulled into a loose braid, as she softly asked to come inside. Evelyn stepped aside and watched her walk into the living room, her eyes darting around as if she expected disapproval. Before she even sat down, she blurted out an apology. She confessed that she had no idea Evelyn hadn't been invited to the reunion, explaining that her mother had made it sound like Evelyn simply hadn't wanted to come. Evelyn felt a wave of sadness mixed with overwhelming gratitude. She motioned for her granddaughter to sit beside her on the couch and gently reassured her that it wasn't her fault. The young girl hesitated, then reached into her tote bag and pulled out a small framed photograph. It was a picture of the two of them at her 5th birthday party, both laughing with sweet frosting smeared on their faces. With shining eyes, her granddaughter explained that she kept the photo on her dresser and just wanted Evelyn to know how much she truly mattered to her. Tears stung Evelyn's eyes as she pressed a trembling hand over her mouth. In that beautiful, healing moment, the years of crushing disappointment finally began to soften, not disappearing entirely, but loosening their suffocating hold on her heart. She whispered a tearful thank you, and they sat together for a long while, the young girl's head resting comfortably on Evelyn's shoulder. When her granddaughter eventually left, the house felt quiet, but it no longer felt empty. That evening, Evelyn poured herself a glass of wine and sat peacefully by the window, watching the sun slowly sink behind the trees. She thought about all the exhausting ways she had tried to earn her place in her family, and all the times she had mistakenly confused obligation for love. And for the very first time in her life, she didn't feel that she owed anyone anything. The valuable lesson for the listener: you cannot buy your worth, and you should never have to audition for your place in someone's life. Evelyn's story is a powerful reminder that generosity is a beautiful trait, but when it is repeatedly met with entitlement and exclusion, it transforms into a toxic obligation. Many of us fall into the trap of believing that if we just give enough, help enough, or sacrifice enough, we will finally be seen and valued by the people we love. The most important takeaway here is that setting boundaries is not an act of cruelty or spite. It is an act of profound self-respect. You are allowed to have edges. You are allowed to stop pouring your energy, time, and finances into people who treat you as a mere convenience. Realize your own value, reclaim your independence, and invest your love into the relationships that freely and joyfully give it back.